Good. A very big welcome to those of you gathered here in the Walled Grave, as we call it here at St Mary's, and to those of you joining through the wonders of live streaming. Let's just begin with a moment of prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, we give thanks to you for calling us together at your service and at the service of our brothers and sisters who are in need, who are victims across our world. We ask you to bless our conversations over these next 2 days, that everything we do may begin with your inspiration, continue with your help, and reach perfection under your guidance, through Christ our Lord. Amen. Our Lady, seat of wisdom, pray for us. Saint Josephine Bakita, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So, just for those of you wondering who I might be, I'm Bishop Richard Moth, the Chair of Governors here at St Mary's University, and I'm delighted to welcome you for this event. A very particular greeting goes to Archbishop Nikitas of Thyatira and Great Britain, and to Father Nathan and his team, putting in so much work and indeed the inspiration for this event that comes so much from them. A very big welcome to the staff of the Bakita Centre here at St Mary's and others in our university community involved in this event. This gathering follows a meeting some time ago, during which the decision was made to move ahead with this, which is an important and, dare I say, historic event in the two fields of ecumenical endeavour and in the work of social justice. The dignity of the human person, rooted in the gospel, is at the heart of our gathering. When we look to the needs of those who are trafficked across the globe, treated as commodities for the profit of others, we find ourselves with a call to action in defence of the oppressed, those held against their will, those unjustly deprived of liberty. We might reflect that the Slavery Abolition Act came into force in this country almost 200 years ago, yet a modern Slavery Act was needed in 2015. And it is thought that there are some 30 million people living in enforced labour, enforced prostitution as child soldiers or child brides across our world, as the property in the servitude of absolute ownership. It's striking to think that in our own present age, it is felt necessary for this country to have appointed an independent commissioner for anti-slavery. Modern slaves are on our streets. They work for no pay. They are deprived of their travel documentation, completely at the mercy of others. This gathering today is therefore a significant moment as St Mary's University continues in its commitment to combat modern slavery through the work of the Bakita Centre for Research on Slavery, Exploitation and Abuse. And we'll be hearing more of the work of the Centre over these 2 days. Together, let us continue the vital task of promoting the dignity of the human person and the work that is so needed to overcome the slavery that is a blight on our present age. I'm delighted now to be able to read a message from His Holiness Pope Francis. His Holiness Pope Francis sends prayerful good wishes to those taking part in the Healing the Wounds of Modern Slavery conference to take place at St Mary's University, Twickenham, in cooperation with the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of Thyatira and Great Britain from the 15th to 16th of October 2021. His Holiness trusts that the conference will draw much needed attention to the threats of enslavement and trafficking facing many poor and vulnerable migrants forced to flee their homes as a result of the climate crisis and armed conflict in our world. It is his hope that by reflecting on the social, legal, and religious dimensions of this pressing global issue, the participants will explore innovative ways of bringing healing to those afflicted by this contemporary cruelty. Invoking upon all present God's gifts of wisdom, joy, and peace, the Holy Father cordially sends his blessing. Signed, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, Secretary of State. We have now a video message which our experts will make work.
Distinguished organizers and speakers, dear participants, it is a pleasure and a privilege to address this patriarchal message to the Conference on Modern Slavery and Human Trafficking, jointly organized by the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of Thyatira and Great Britain, together with St. Mary's University in London, with the inspiration of His Eminence Archbishop Nikitas. The subject of your presentations and deliberations is healing the wounds of modern slavery, a painful and persistent problem of our age. Permit us then to focus on the two key terms of your theme, wounds and healing. We often speak of wounds inflicted or endured by human beings in the local and global society. Nevertheless, we normally imagine that the wounds are carried by those who are exploited and abused. In our minds, we conventionally perceive ourselves as being the Good Samaritans rather than acting as highway criminals. For some reason, it seems so much easier to consider ourselves as helpers and not as hurters, as contributing to the solution but not as exacerbating the problem. This is a very common temptation for those in the helping or pastoral fields, and it is a particularly prevalent problem for those in religious circles. This false conception is surely presumptuous and arrogant, for until and unless we accept that we are all part of a vicious cycle that demonstrates indifference and ignorance toward other people, and especially the marginalized and those living in poverty, then we cannot even properly address this critical challenge of contemporary communities. Until and unless we appreciate how all people are intimately and inseparably interconnected, and we are all part of this problem, then we cannot hope to appropriately discuss and discover solutions to this human stigma. And if we think of modern slavery and human trafficking from this perspective, then we will understand and believe that the wounds of which we speak do not actually refer to the victims of such unspeakable crimes, but instead to us for failing to protect the vulnerable and susceptible in our midst. This, however, means that the wounds are not only externally our responsibility as citizens and as believers, but they in fact describe internally our own condition of sickness and sinfulness. The other key term in your conference theme is healing. This concept includes numerous dimensions and nuances. For Christians in particular, it echoes the healing ministry of our Lord, who came to proclaim the good news to the poor, freedom to the enslaved, recovery of sight to the blind, and liberation to the oppressed. Moreover, healing implies health and wholeness, but also integrity and reintegration. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, healing and wholeness involve and invite the element of holiness. This means that to the degree that we confront, alleviate, and eliminate the scourges of modern slavery and human trafficking, to the same degree we are capable of approaching and adopting the holiness of God. But the opposite also holds true. To the degree that we tolerate and neglect the widespread reality of modern slavery and human trafficking, to the same degree we are removing and estranging ourselves from the holiness of God. Dear friends, the decision is ours alone to make, but the implications affect countless others, especially the most vulnerable among us. We are accountable for these choices and consequences to ourselves, to one another, and to the God of love and righteousness. Thank you for your kind attention.
Your Eminence, my Lord, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Anthony McLaren, Vice Chancellor here at St Mary's, and it's my pleasure to reiterate the welcome that Bishop Richard has given you all to this conference on healing the wounds of modern slavery. The inspiration for the conference began a year ago during the very dark days of the pandemic and lockdown. At this time, just after I joined the university as Vice Chancellor, I discovered that His Eminence Archbishop Nikita shared with St Mary's a burning concern to combat the scourge of modern slavery. We extended an invitation to the Archbishop and Father Nifon to visit St Mary's in December 2020 and to hear about the work of our Bakita Centre for Research on Slavery, Exploitation and Abuse. And I think that visit was probably the first external visit that we've had during since the lockdown had begun, and it was particularly welcome for that reason. Formerly known as the Centre for the Study of Modern Slavery, the name change in the centre was proposed in 2020 to better reflect the broader remit of the research and other activities of centre staff. Named after St. Josephine Bakita, herself trafficked from the Sudan at the age of 8 across the Middle East and eventually into Italy, we wanted to honour her journey and its reflection of the experience of many victims and survivors of slavery, exploitation and abuse, but also to reflect the resilience of survivors in overcoming trauma and finding hope for the future. Established in 2015 as a flagship research centre, the centre was part of St Mary's University's commitment to respond to the growing scale of human trafficking and slavery in the UK and across the globe. In 2014, the Home Office estimated that there were 10 to 13,000 potential victims of modern slavery exploited in the UK alone. However, this is almost certainly a vast underestimate. In 2020, more than 10,000 men, women and children were referred into the National Referral Mechanism, which provides support to victims nationally. Worldwide, as we've heard from Bishop Richard, the figure for those who are subject to human trafficking, slavery, servitude and forced labour is estimated at well over 30 million. The centre is part of the initiative of our Chancellor, Cardinal Vincent Nichols, to combat slavery and trafficking, along with Bakita House, a London-based safe house for trafficked women, and the Santa Marta Group, which seeks to coordinate the efforts of law enforcement authorities, NGOs, and governments worldwide. The Centre's role is to support this initiative with research which will feed into anti-slavery and human trafficking policy at the highest level in the UK and internationally, and to contribute to education and awareness raising. Our most recent education project, the Horizon Summer School, offered education to 9 survivors of modern slavery from 7 different countries on campus at St Mary's this past summer. It was a great success and summed up very well by one survivor who said, "Trust me, it has helped me a lot in my personal life. Before I started summer school, I was not okay at all. My mind was not settled. I've been in my room crying. I had nothing to do, just sit here thinking. But when I heard that I have a summer school to go to, and when I get there, meet friends, my teachers, they are so good, so friendly, I can't wait to go. Everybody, even in my house, told me, you have changed. They do not see me at home all the time, so that is good." For St Mary's, the work at the Bakita Centre is a key part of our commitment as a university to teaching, learning and research that has impact on issues of social inclusion and justice, those issues that motivated the founders of this institution nearly 175 years ago. Now, we're planning an international conference such as this, and at this point, I must echo the thanks to Father Nifon, Professor Peter Tyler, and Dr. Carol Murphy, who put so much effort into the planning of the conference. Like a dinner party, there's always that fear of who will come, particularly at these very uncertain times when everyone is just getting used again to traveling and to visiting and to being together in events like this. So I must say it's wonderful to see people actually in the room, as well as the many attendees that we have attending the conference virtually. You're all extremely welcome. There's a clear testament, I think, in the attendance to the widespread concern to tackle this issue from a Christian perspective. In this respect, the conference is divided, as you will have seen from the programme, into 2 halves. Today's presentations and discussions will concentrate on the wounds of modern slavery, looking at its causes, reasons and origins, and we're delighted to welcome Dame Sarah Thornton, the UK's Anti-Slavery Commissioner here, who is going to be opening proceedings for us shortly by outlining some of her own work and the work of the Commission on tackling this issue. This will be followed by a number of panels drawing upon the expertise of practitioners and scholars engaged in this work on an international level. However, the wounds are only part of the whole picture. Tomorrow, attention will be turned to the healing that we can help effect from those wounds through research, through teaching, through action, through solidarity with the trafficked and enslaved, through the perspectives of faith, and through listening to the voices of survivors themselves. St Josephine Bakita, the inspiration for our centre here at St Mary's, believed that if these wounds are open to Christ's presence, great love and healing could once again flow. And so there will be liturgy at this conference in a service of Vespers in the University Chapel led by our Orthodox friends. And tomorrow the conference organisers decided to concentrate on how the arts can help this healing process. And we're delighted to welcome a number of outstanding performers and practitioners to conclude the conference. Now, before I hand over to Dame Sarah, I'd like to share a message of support that we've received from our Chancellor.
I'm very pleased to welcome you to this conference at the Bakita Centre of St Mary's University, studying modern-day slavery and human trafficking. This is such an important topic to many, many millions of people whom we know are caught up in effective slavery in our world today. This is a problem which is getting worse. And it's not just a problem, it's an experience of degradation and helplessness of so many people. So it is a charge that we bear to do our best to counter this trafficking in human beings. I say it's getting worse, and that's for obvious reasons, because there is such human vulnerability around the world today. We can see that as a consequence of the pandemic. We can see it as a consequence of violence in many places. We can see it as a consequence of the challenges around the environment and the changes that are taking place. All of this makes the supply chain of victims, potential victims for human trafficking, even greater. There are things that we can do, in fact, on many, many different fronts, and study is one of them. Obviously, direct action in cooperation with the police, direct action to do with supply chains and business, direct action to do with the laundering of the enormous profits that emerge for criminals from this trade. But it's important that these issues are studied, and in particular, how we best understand the trap in which victims of human trafficking have been caught, and how we best help them to repair those wounds. Wounds which Pope Francis describes as wounds in the body of Christ. So I wish you well for this conference. I thank you for the dedication and effort that it represents, and I hope that you will leave this conference more determined than ever to play a part in this fight against modern day slavery. Thank you all very much indeed.
Encouraged and inspired by the messages of support we've received from the Patriarch, from Pope, from our Chancellor, we now go to our first speaker, and I'm really delighted to introduce Dame Sarah Thornton, the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, responsible for encouraging good practice in prevention and detection of modern slavery and identification of victims. Dame Sarah was Chief Constable of Thames Valley Police from 2007 to 2015, and the first chair of the National Police Chiefs Council from 2015 to 19. She's currently chair of the Government Skills and Curriculum Unit Leadership Advisory Board and an honorary Air Commodore in the Royal Air Force. She is also honorary professor in modern slavery at the Centre for the Study of International Slavery at the University of Liverpool. So could you join me in welcoming Dame Sarah?
Okay, lovely. I'm glad you were doing that and not me, actually. Thank you very much indeed. So great to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me. I was just refreshing my mind last night about the objectives of your conference and thinking about to what extent my keynote to open is going to cover the objectives. And I think I can promise you that I'll speak to 3 of your 4 objectives. But you'll really want to focus on the protection of victims and survivors, particularly thinking about health and public health approaches. So I really hope I will cover that. Thinking about creative interventions as a means of healing wounds. And I've got some examples of that for you. Talking about partnerships to support prevention, identification, protection, and that hopefully will run through everything I say. On the 4th objective, which was about the role of ecclesial and religious communities, I probably will leave that to the experts, other than to say, it seems to me that the role, particularly of faith groups in slavery trafficking, has been substantial both in the UK and globally. And certainly from my own experience, having been to Bakita House, a safe house that's supported by the diocese, I always say it's the nicest safe house I've ever been to. It just has a sense of welcome and sanctuary, and I know the women there really do appreciate it. So hopefully I will cover 3 out of 4 objectives. I thought I'd talk a little bit about my role. I will talk about empowering victims to become survivors and the work we do on that, and what I mean by that. I will talk about access to work, which is part, I think, of survival. As promised, I'll talk a bit about public health approaches, which are gaining ground, and I would want to encourage you to think about those. Talk about the importance of the relationship between research, policy, and practice. And in many ways, St Mary's is an embodiment of that link that you have with research in an academic institution, but very much linking into practice and linking into policy. And then I'll finish with some examples of creative interventions at the end. So hopefully that will make some sense, and then very happy to answer questions. So As Bishop Richard said at the beginning, you referred to the 1833 Abolition Act and then said, and then who would think that in 2015 we would need an anti-slavery commissioner? Well, it was decided that that was an appropriate part of that Modern Slavery Act 2015. It's actually an international model of best practice, but as well as responsibility across government for tackling slavery and trafficking, that states should appoint what's usually known as a rapporteur. I'm not quite a rapporteur. They refer to me internationally as an equivalent mechanism, which is fine. But it's that sense of sitting independently from government. And that's very important. It's an independent public appointment. I'm accountable through a strategic plan and annual reports, which I would love to be able to lay them directly before Parliament. I have to do that via the Secretary of State, which is the Home Secretary. To be fair, I'm given pretty much a free rein, and they tend to just correct any grammatical errors or spelling mistakes when we have a draft. So they don't seek to control it. So they do honour that independence. And it's very light on powers. There are a number of public authorities, which I've listed there, which are under a duty to cooperate with me, particularly law enforcement, but also border security, local government, health bodies. And the GLAA, sorry for that acronym, is the Gang Masters and Labour Abuse Authority. They're the organisation to really focus on exploitation in certain key sectors like agriculture. So that's how the role is set out. And as I think Anthony said, my role is to encourage good practice. I don't deal with cases. The legislation actually precludes that. And sometimes I think that's frustrating, but most of the time I think if we had to do that, we'd have to have, 10 times the number of staff, because there are a lot of cases where people need support and help. So it's very much about encouraging good practice in terms of preventing slavery, detecting, investigating, prosecuting, but also the identification of victims and witnesses. And I think a lot of what we'll talk about today is in connection with that second area. And also thinking about once we've identified victims and they've been supported to become survivors, how do we ensure that they don't get re-victimized, re-trafficked? How do we make sure that they are able to lead lives of sustainable independence? I mentioned the strategic plan, which the Home Secretary laid before Parliament 2 years ago, actually, nearly exactly 2 years ago. And we set 4 priorities, and I'm very relieved that we wrote them at such a high level that they've kind of sort of stood the test of time. But just to give you a flavour of what we're doing, but I'll very much focus on victim care and support. That's the first priority, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But I also do quite a lot of work around supporting law enforcement and prosecutions. One of the frustrations in this area is that there are still, both in the UK and internationally, far too few prosecutions of those who enslave and traffic. I know that they're really difficult investigations, they're complex, they're complicated, they're international. The witnesses, the victims who are witnesses, are extremely vulnerable, extremely difficult for them for all sorts of reasons to give evidence. And as a consequence, I think that the traffickers often view the risks as high, the risks as low and the rewards as high, i.e. the risk of being caught. One of the things that shocked me in connection with the case of the Vietnamese people who were trafficked across from France and Belgium into the UK 2 years ago, 39 people who lost their lives. Talking to the detectives who dealt with that case, those traffickers had been trafficking people in lorries frequently. And just on this occasion, they put double the number in, which is frankly what led to the deaths. And what shocked me was that the profit they make from trafficking people is much greater than the profit they make from trafficking guns or drugs. It's just a very profitable business where people are a commodity. So supporting law enforcement, trying to get police forces to work, particularly with the National Crime Agency, and also thinking about how we use all the powers under the Modern Slavery Act. There are lots of powers, not just to prosecute under sections 1 and 2 of the Act, but also to put in place prevention orders, risk orders, to take money off the traffickers so that victims can be compensated. There's a whole range of things that I think we need to be doing there. The third priority is about focusing on prevention. And if you think about it, in many ways, slavery and trafficking are economic crimes. They're crimes where the perpetrators want to make money and the commodity is people. And if you think about kind of the basic 3 ingredients for a crime to take place, you need to have an offender who is motivated and capable. You need a victim who is vulnerable, but you also need the right sort of environment in which for it to take place. And so trying to think about those broader issues about what is it that's conducive in the environment to these offending, how can we think about changing that? How can we prevent it? And the very obvious thing we do a lot of work on is thinking about business in particular. How do goods made by forced labour in either this country or globally get into the supply chains? How do all of us end up buying goods that have been made by forced labour? And what can business do and what can financial services do to change those financial and economic models to stop that happening? To say, in the goods and services that we sell, we are absolutely intolerant of any forced labour. And that's not just about having some ethics department, it's about thinking about every aspect of the business. Are we absolutely clear that what we're buying has not got forced labour in the supply chain? So I do a lot of work on that, and I think that's a really key area. And frankly, I have found in the last 2.5 years that businesses, for all sorts of reasons, not least reputational, let's face it, but they are open to these issues and quite responsive, and sometimes more responsive than government is in terms of kind of the long haul on legislation. And the last area that we prioritise is getting value from research and innovation. And it's linked to that point I made earlier, that when I came into the post, I realised that so many universities and other higher education sort of institutions across the country were doing lots of research. But was it really connecting with policy, and was it connecting with practice to really understand what works, what's effective, and how we get better at preventing slavery and trafficking in the first place, but also thinking about what works in terms of supporting survivors, what works in terms of effective prosecution. So that's been a kind of key area for me as well, and we've developed lots of different partnerships with regard to that. So that's a kind of overview, but I'm going to talk mostly about improving victim care and support. And the 4 areas that we've been focusing on, first one is about better identifying victims. Very often, victims are hidden. We've just been talking about cases of domestic servitude, where often they are the most hidden victims. Sometimes victims don't realise that they are victims because they feel that they've consented to what's happening. They don't see themselves as victims. And so making sure that everybody who's charged with identifying victims, and that's mainly statutory agencies, but there are some charities and NGOs who do that as well. But whether it's the border force, whether it's the police force, whether it's the social workers in children's social care or adult social care, that they know what they're looking for and they know how to refer people to support. That's the key area. And also then, once people are referred, improving the quality of victim support. And I'm really pleased to say in the last couple of years that the safe houses that are run by the Home Office are now part of the Care Quality Commission inspection regime. So there is a real effort to make sure that support is being provided, and particularly support is being provided in a trauma-informed way and meeting the needs. And also, I think, so important, sort of culturally competent, culturally sensitive to the fact that a lot of people in safe houses and in support will not be from the UK. And we need to make sure the support that they receive is sensitive to their background and is appropriate for their background. The third area I call taking a longer term view, and I'll cover this a little bit more, but it's not just about identifying a victim, making sure they're safe and they're being looked after. But it's also about how do we help people to prepare for their survival. And in fact, not just survival, that they can thrive. And so issues about access to mental health support, issues such as education, training, skills development, but also employment, as and when people are ready, I think are absolutely key. And we've done quite a lot of work on that. Trying to just push it all the time. It's very frustrating, but I think it's very important. And then we've done quite a lot of work on supporting child victims, and Ruth from St Mary's was with us at Cumberland Lodge for 2 days, from Sunday to Tuesday, looking specifically at the support for child victims of trafficking, whether from outside the UK or in the UK. So that's a key area. So this is a blog we wrote 2 years ago. And the concern I had then was very much that once the victim's identified, they are in a bureaucratic system of government, which is assessing that they are a victim for a very long time. And I think I wrote this pretty much at the very beginning, because I've been to safe houses, and the one thing people kept saying to me was, we just feel our lives are on hold. We're waiting for a decision about whether we're a victim of trafficking. And then if we are claiming asylum, we're waiting a long time for asylum decisions. And that sense of life being in limbo was what really, really struck me. And if you have that degree of insecurity in your life, I think it's really hard to think seriously about recovery, because that's the thing that's always at the back of your mind. You know, where am I going to be in a few months' time? I don't know. I haven't got that security. And my sense as well is that people were in limbo, victims were in limbo. And in some places I went to, and oddly enough, in Scotland and Northern Ireland, it seemed to be much better. That when I went to safe houses, if I went during the day, there was nobody there, which is good, because they were out at college accessing all sorts of different courses. But actually in England, often, and Wales to a certain extent, it seems to be very dependent on where you are and what you want to study, and huge kind of variation in access to education. And, you know, I remember talking to a survivor who just had his decisions and was leaving a safe house, a man, an older man actually, from Vietnam. And I said, what are you going to do now? And he said, I'm going to go and live in this place in South London, and I'm going to do some training on becoming a chef. And I thought, that's great. You know, he had a purpose, and I thought, actually, what have you been doing for the last 3 years? You know, why on earth couldn't we kind of sorted it out that you spent all your time in a safe house? You could have been training and therefore kind of hit the ground running once you leave. And that frustration about access to education is highly variable. And also access to work. So my goodness, it's one of those things which was a niche issue 2 years ago. I think now everybody knows about the single occupation list, who isn't allowed to work because of the shortages. But it's exactly that issue that people who, this dates it, of course, because this is pre-Brexit. It now applies to people without settled status from the European Economic Area as well. But that if you weren't a UK citizen, now, if you aren't, it's highly unlikely that you'll have the right to work. So that sense as well, that people are living, you know, on the breadline when actually they've got skills. And you know, there's all sorts of research which shows that the longer you're in that situation not working, this is for asylum seekers, the harder it is to get back into work eventually. So I'm really quite concerned about this. So what I'd done originally, and I'm actually going to go back to my planning, was that I was trying to persuade the minister at the time that wouldn't it be good to do some piloting of allowing victims of slavery to work in programs like the Bright Futures program. Maybe people have heard about that. It was set up by the co-op. There's about 20 different businesses, people like John Lewis, Vodafone, Waitrose, lots of high street names you will recognise, who offer work for victims of slavery, but they have to have the right to work, of course, because those companies can't break the law. And I was saying, look, can't we just do some special pilots. And no, we're doing a review of asylum right to work. We can't possibly do that. And so I thought, okay, well, I've hit a brick wall there. Let me kind of do a bit more work just to show how strong the argument is about the importance of work. So looking at the benefits of work and what are the barriers. And so we looked at, with the Rights Lab in Nottingham University, what are the harms caused by not working? How can we assist survivors to access employment and to reintegrate? How can we work towards their stability and independence? And employment's not the be-all and end-all, as that final point says. It's part of the equation towards survivors achieving that sustainable independence. But it can be a vital part, providing all the things that we know that work provides about routine, stability, financial independence. So we published that report earlier this year, and we made what I thought were very practical recommendations. They weren't about sort of kind of going head on about the right to work. They were about saying that when people are being supported in the victim care contract, can we do some work to see what skills people have got, what qualifications, what are their aspirations? So that at least we're thinking as part of survival, part of that, providing people with maybe counselling or health support, legal support, but we actually think about their employability. And let's think about doing some work to accredit preparation for work. There are different organisations, and I know in the summer, your Horizon Summer School partnered with the Sophie Hayes Foundation. Sophie Hayes, for many years, Snowdrop up in Sheffield, have done work which is about employability skills. But could we make that a bit more standardised? Could we encourage more people to do that? Because having participated in some of the Sophie Hayes work, I think it's really, really good. And then thinking about recommendation 3, thinking really about reintegration. And reintegration can be in the UK, but I also think we should have much better reintegration for those survivors who would like to go home. Very few properly supported as they go home. And I do think it could make a difference. I was talking to somebody from Sophie Hayes yesterday, and we were talking about Freedom Quilt, which I'll mention in a minute. They're doing a great project with lots of survivors making like a patchwork quilt square. And they've got some great sort of, quilt making creative person who organises it. So it'll look great. It's a partnership with Liberty, and they're doing all sorts of great things. And they had their first workshop with survivors last week, and she was saying to me, and she said, so many of them, when they were asked to start doing something creative about something that mattered to them, actually were focusing on family. And I think that whole issue about if we had proper reintegration, the problem about asylum is that you're then stuck really in this country, you can't go home and you're remote family. So it just seems to me that reintegration, thinking about family, is really key. And of course, the fourth recommendation is what all academics always recommend, that there needs to be more research. They always. So there's a new minister now, so I'm going to have another go at this because I do think it's absolutely key. Either let's do a pilot, or please, come on, the evidence is so clear, and let's try and work within that victim care contract to build people's employability. And it just seems to me, if you're thinking about opportunities for faith communities, or indeed university, actually thinking about this area, it seems to me is a key area. So I thought also I would talk about the public health approach, because that was mentioned in one of your objectives. Now, I don't know how familiar people are with this. So I'll assume sort of reasonably basic knowledge. When we talk about a public health approach, what we mean is thinking about slavery and trafficking as something which kind of can have a profound impact on health. And if we want to prevent it from happening in the first place, thinking about it in quite a structured way. And I'll start with those triangles on the right-hand side. And the quote is from a paper that was written a couple of years ago. But you start with what's known as primary prevention, which is how do we immunise the population as a whole? Now, the example in this paper is about violence, but for violence, you could use modern slavery and trafficking. But what has been piloted and sort of progressed is a public health approach to violence. But my argument is you can have a public health approach to modern slavery control. So what can we do to immunise the general population to modern slavery control? What can we do to make it less likely? And issues about support for very vulnerable migrants was a common theme in those first sessions. So that might be one example. So what do you do to immunise the general population? Then you move up to secondary prevention. What can you do to protect those who are exposed? So that might be, I mentioned the Gang Masters and Labour Abuse Authority. That might be people, say in this country, who we know are working in sectors which historically have had forced labour. So let's talk about maybe agriculture or food processing or logistics support. And so what can we do to make sure that workers' rights in those workplaces are generally something that are observed, that actually rules about health and safety, that people have proper contracts, that they get holiday pay, that they get sick pay, all the things that are legal, that they're legally entitled to. Because we know if there are gaps in that sort of thing, it actually makes more forced labour much more. So how do you think about those who are exposed? And then right at the very top, how do you rescue those at risk? And in a way, that's when all other prevention has failed. And that's about making sure that you are identifying and rescuing victims, that you're supporting prosecutions. And with all issues, of course, the problem is the state spends most money on the top of the triangle and least money on the bottom of the triangle. And so the debate is always, can you shift more into primary prevention, just thinking about that. So that's kind of a little sort of summary of the public health approach. And on the left-hand side, those cogs, which I pinched from a police document on public health approaches to violence, what they would say is these are the key elements if you're going to have a public health approach. You need to be thinking about the population as a whole. You need to be working in partnership. You need to be thinking about prevention. You need data, and you need evidence, you need to understand what works, and you need to be thinking all the time about what are the causes of the causes. Not just why is this happening, but what are the causes of that? So I think it's a really interesting approach. I was very aware of it from my background in policing, but it was a meeting a couple of years ago where we had a whole load of health practitioners around the room, and we talked about a public health approach and thought, maybe this could have some application, because we knew it had been used in serious violence and we knew it had been used for child sexual exploitation. So we agreed to have a round table with Public Health England, literally just before the pandemic, but notwithstanding that, we have continued to do this work, but thinking about how can we develop this role for multi-agency partnerships, how can Public Health England get more involved in, and the last point 3 was much more about trying to, I wrote to every, what do they call it? The College of Surgeons, the College of Paediatricians, the Royal College of Nursing, all of them to say, is slavery trafficking included in your training? And we were doing a lot of that as well. But we really wanted to develop a public health approach. And one of my colleagues at that point found Dr. Liz Such, who had done some early work on this. And so I met Liz in a coffee shop in Sheffield when I was up there, because she's based at the University of Sheffield, and got together with Liz and Public Health England to build on some earlier work that she'd done, which we published in June or July this year. 3 things was a kind of a full report, really examining a public health approach to modern slavery, and basically saying there is an awful lot to commend this. It makes a lot of sense. Particularly thinking about prevention. We also created a little microsite with an interactive framework, so you could kind of look at how it works, and also a guide for local partners. There are about, I think it's something like 95 multi-agency partnerships across the country tackling modern slavery, so different organisations coming together locally. They vary a lot. They do lots of good work, but it just seemed to me that a public health approach, a preventative framework, would be a useful way to kind of organise all the work that they're doing. Because sometimes it's a bit like there's a good idea here and a good idea there, and actually thinking about all together, can we use the data, understand the issue in our area, what interventions might work. Let's try them, do they work? That sort of thing. So we published that in the summer, and we're now doing some work in the Southwest, and I'm hoping to do it in a few more partnerships, just testing whether this works and how it works. And so I also then decided, because I know that the Home Secretary is rewriting the modern slavery strategy, so I thought that I could encourage her to take a sort of preventative approach. And so I wrote to her, and to be fair, I knew some of her officials were quite interested in this idea. So I'm kind of pushing that, because I think we need a public health approach locally, but we also really benefit from the public health approach nationally. And so she wrote back to me saying that she welcomed the work that we've been doing and the opportunities afforded by a public health approach. She liked the emphasis on prevention, and we know that preventing vulnerable people being drawn into slavery is one of the most effective ways of tackling this crime. Welcome continued intervention. Prevention must and will continue to be a key element of our approach to tackling slavery. They're working on a strategy. I will continue to push this because I think it has great value. We'll see whether we have any success. So I just thought I might share with you some of the other work that we have been involved in if you're thinking about survivors, interventions, their needs. I thought it would be useful just to signpost some areas. The first is the work that Dr. Sian Oram has been doing at King's College London. She's an expert in women's mental health. They did a first project, Protect 1, and they're doing a second project, Protect 2. But they were really working in some detail about what were the mental health needs of victims and survivors. And suffice it to say, they are substantial, and there is a big gap with access to services. And she's continuing to do more work and looking particularly at the effectiveness of interventions and what's appropriate. Because I think, I'm no expert in this, but listening to the experts, it seems to me that it's a very complex area and it's quite easy to do the wrong thing. So great partner in Sian Oram. We've also been working with Vita, and I'm going to just share something else that Vita has been doing in a minute. Computers to work again. But they are an organisation of doctors founded by Rosie Riley, who's an inspirational person if you've ever met her. They've been working mainly with doctors, but with the health service in general, about trying to get a much better response from the health service. They've done lots of training about identification of victims, trying to make sure that people get person-centred, trauma-informed care. And they, as I say, they've been training lots of people, and they do some really good stuff. And I was just going to share with you something which I received yesterday, because it's Anti-Slavery Day next week. And they are doing a campaign at the moment, which they shared with me, which I thought was so good. And it's so important in the current context, because there is legislation in the Nationality and Borders Bill, which is going through Parliament at the moment, which kind of assumes that if you ask somebody who's very vulnerable and maybe a victim, tell us about what's happened to you within 10 days, that they can just do that. And this kind of failure to understand trauma is really quite substantial. So Vita are running this campaign at the moment called What Does Trauma Look Like? And they're trying to break this concept of an ideal victim of trauma by raising awareness of issues of trauma. And just a couple of quotations from this, and I'm going to read them because I just think that they're just so eloquent and so correct. We can so often look at the behaviour and not see the trauma driving it. All of us respond to trauma in automatic and appropriate ways to survive. Then Rosie says, as healthcare professionals, we will work with survivors of all forms of trauma, from one-off experiences through to those surviving terrifying lives. We need to expand our understanding of how humans adapt and survive, so we can recognise that when behaviour may be a signal of deeper fear and distress, we must challenge ourselves not only to look for the ideal victim, someone who may be timid, polite and implied, and grateful for our care. And then her colleague, Laura, who is also a paediatric doctor, says recognising and responding to victims of human trafficking in a trauma-informed way is a vital step in restoring dignity and human rights. We're supporting individuals who have been severely exploited and treated as commodities instead of people. It's critical that we see the child behind the chaos, the young person behind the bravado. If you've been forced to focus on your survival, all the priorities change. No child or young person is able to comprehend and consent to the far-reaching harm that follows on from grooming and exploitation. And you'll remember at the weekend, Ruth, we talked a lot about this. So often we respond to the behaviour rather than the trauma. And by the way, we do that in a way which is very biased against certain ethnicities. So I think that's a great campaign. If you see any that's quite lively on Twitter at the moment, please support it. But I really think their work is great. We've also been supporting some work again with the Rights Lab in Nottingham, and they've been working with survivors of Survivor Alliance. Again, on looking at survivors' experience of mental health and recovery. And they are now doing a follow-on project, which is going to be co-produced about thinking about what does recovery mean. And what's fascinating listening to them is that if you have led a life that's been terrifying, sometimes the way the body copes and survives it just gets very deep, because that's the way, and you're never going to come to terms with it, you just have to bury it. And kind of understanding from the survivor's perspective what is helpful and what's not helpful is really important. So that's another great piece of work, thinking about these different issues. And the last example there is something that we are doing ourselves. We recruited a survivor to work with the team, and she is working on a project entitled Our Victims and Survivors of Modern Slavery within the NRM. So that's being supported by the Home Office, provided with mental health support that's appropriate to their needs. I can tell you, she is a person who has been in the NRM with mental health issues, because it's not, but we're doing some work and reaching out to other survivors to hear about their work. So this area of mental health is really important. And then lastly, I was just going to name check some of the work with Ruth and the team. I mentioned this gap between research, policy and practice. One of the very sort of small contributions to this is some work that I encourage Ruth and Anta to do, looking about what looks promising. So there's lots of good practitioner evidence, and they pulled together some work about what looks promising in terms of good practice to help survivors. And I've just been talking to one of the victim navigators, help survivors through the criminal justice system, how to develop capacity in frontline professionals. And that last point is so important, how to ensure that survivor voice is right at the centre of what we do. And then creative interventions. Just, I think, 3 examples I've got here. I'm going to go and visit Artist Freedom next week. I think it's the 3rd time I've done it. Hestia, which is one of the charities that does a lot of support for both victims of slavery and domestic abuse. They do a great exhibition every year, featuring work by survivors, and it's always great. I was online last year, which wasn't as good. The year before was great, just talking to the survivors about how they had so much enjoyed learning a new skill. They felt kind of part of a group, and I think sometimes kind of these kind of creative ways can be really good ways to kind of begin to talk about paint or cameras. I think we're doing a lot of photography last year, to express their kind of needs and their fears and their hopes and dreams. So that's a really good one, Artist Freedom. I mentioned the Freedom Quilt. So Hayes Foundation, they've got, I think it's 3,000 squares they're doing. It's a lot. And a year-long initiative, making this Freedom Quilt in collaboration with Liberty. They're going to take it around the country, and then they're going to house it in the Slavery Museum in Liverpool. Bringing together lots of people who've been through the Sophie Hayes work. And again, each square will embody their past and future hopes, their dreams. And as I said, Red was saying to me that actually this theme of family was already a big thing that was coming. So that's another great thing to encourage. And the last one was an exhibition I went to about 3 weeks ago. The Real Faces of Modern Slavery and Mastering the Truth. This is an exhibition in Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. It's moving around the county. I went to see it at Fareham. There's lots of different content, but there is some of it is survivor art as well, which is really, really moving. So again, just another example of creative interventions, which I think it seems to me they're gathering pace, and it seems to me that it is very effective, though we need to evaluate them. Thank you very much indeed.